Russia dismisses as baseless reports that the country is orchestrating a false flag incident in order to invade neighboring Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the allegations are unsubstantiated and not backed by evidence. Western media have said Russia has sent operatives into disputed regions in eastern Ukraine. They've quoted anonymous U.S. officials who echoed Kiev's claims that Moscow is seeking a provocation. For weeks now, the U.S. and the Western military alliance, NATO, have been accusing Russia of planning an attack on Ukraine. That has raised tensions with Moscow, which is unhappy with increased military activity by NATO near its borders. Now, in order to get further insight on that story, I'm joined by Scott Bennett. He is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer joining us from San Francisco. Mr. Bennett, thank you for joining Press TV. So reports have come out that Russia is orchestrating a false flag operation and is creating a pretext to invade Ukraine. Are these reports backed by evidence? And if not, why are they coming out?
Well, I think it is the West, specifically the United States and the Biden administration and their over-aggressive military that has fabricated this fantasy, and they are really reflecting their own agenda, their own ambition, their own intent. There will be a false flag event, but it won't be orchestrated by Russia. It'll be orchestrated by the West, most likely the United States, Britain, and Israel, to try and create a flashpoint. And Russia has said this weeks and weeks ago that they had picked up this intelligence. So the West is sort of behind the eight ball. They are scattered. They are disorganized. Their diplomatic objectives and abilities are completely scatterbrained and tattered, very much reflective of Joe Biden's scatterbrained dementia and confusion. So they're trying their best to throw up as much smoke and confusion and distraction as they can against Russia, in the hopes that somehow Russia is going to grow fatigued or be intimidated and hesitant. And I think that is a tragic miscalculation of the Russian temperament, mind, and political stance at this point. They have said very clearly, this is not a simple choice of Russia. This is a culmination of 30 years of violence, oppression, deception, and aggression against Russia that the West has orchestrated since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the promises that were made were betrayed. The guarantees were never fulfilled, and Russia has endured and really been injured by many of these actions. The world has indeed been injured by the West's actions after 9/11, and I think this is culminating into the Russians affirming a stance and preparing to defend themselves from what they perceive are existential threats.
Well, let's just discuss the talks between Russia and NATO and the U.S., which have failed. And one reason why they have failed is because NATO and the U.S. refused to meet Russia's security demands. What do you think that happened?
Well, the U.S. and the British and the globalist bankers and many in their circle have been long fantasizing about discombobulating and dismembering Russia into pieces so that they could buy off and use their natural resources. So the West and NATO have been aggressively trying to bluff and push Russia around. And I think they've miscalculated, because Russia is fully prepared and they're very, very competent in diplomatic warfare. And that's what this is. There's diplomatic warfare, there's information warfare, there's military warfare, and there's economic warfare. And they are preparing themselves, and they're winning the diplomatic warfare, and they're winning the informational warfare. But I think an interesting opportunity is, since the West is in such disarray, the best thing that, for example, Iran could do is Iran, Venezuela, and Russia really unite their public relations message around some core beliefs that resonate with Western audiences. And for example, Russia could say, we want to create a world of stability, peace, and independence from the Western juggernaut of destruction and slavery that has been terrorizing the world since 2001. And we are standing up to this hegemonic empire that is seeking to advance a religion of wokeness and force it upon the rest of the world. They would find that many in the European countries and many in America would stand up and side with the moral imperatives of independence, freedom, stability. And also, I think Russia needs to stand up and announce that the Kazakhstan color revolution, which failed, is the same color revolution that the West tried to impose upon Venezuela when they tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government and replace him with Juan Guaido, a CIA asset. So the most important thing that needs to be emphasized is that the West is trying to advance wokeism and a sort of religion of economics and political correctness, and that is destructive to the freedom and the independence of other nations. So Russia and Iran and Venezuela certainly can unite around a moral code and stand up and say what the West has done for 20 years is ruined, destroyed other countries. Look at Libya, look at Syria, and they're trying to do the same thing to Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. And they need to call out the European nations to recognize that they are the ones that will be injured. They're the ones that will lose sons and daughters for wars that the West starts, and that no European should have any interest in participating. And Russia should also emphasize that it's not starting a war. It is defending against a war that the West is trying to trigger, and this false flag claim is the flashpoint.
Mr. Bennett, I have one last question for you, but I want you to answer it like in 30 seconds if you can. Now, speaking of Russia's preparedness, one threat that is being directed towards Russia is that the U.S. says that it will bring the case to the United Nations Security Council. What will the consequences be if it does so?
Well, I think it would be wonderful if the West took any case to the Security Council, because it would give a stage, an opportunity for Russia, for Iran, and other nations to stand up and give their own presentation. The West has always used the United Nations as a platform for pontificating, and as we know from Colin Powell's day, telling flat-out lies and then bribing other countries and other officials to side with those lies in order to give a legal defense to war and crimes against humanity. And that's what they did in Iraq. That's what they did in Afghanistan. Especially Iraq, they claimed, because Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israelis and the Zionist liars, went to the U.S. and claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Colin Powell got up in front of the United Nations and told those lies. So the United Nations is a platform, is a stage for theatrics. But the West are very bad liars, because they have 20 years of ruin and death that they said was going to instead create blossoms of prosperity, peace, and happiness. And instead, they've destroyed the entire Middle East. Russia and Iran and Venezuela are countries that can stand up and say our fellow countries in the United Nations don't believe them. The reality is quite different. Don't vote with them, vote with us. And I think they'd see the world side with them.
Thank you so much. Mr. Scott Bennett joining us from San Francisco, was a former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer.
Let's discuss this a bit further with Mr. Scott Bennett. He's a former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer who joins us via Skype out of San Francisco. Mr. Bennett, as always, it's good to have you with us. How do you reflect on this, sir?
Well, I think the notification of the United States that Russia may be putting weaponry of any description, any satellites, any listening devices, any intelligence personnel, any Spetsnaz in Venezuela or Cuba is enough to cause the United States CIA and the Biden administration to essentially come apart at the seams because of the political implications of how that will be seen by the domestic audience, by the American people. They will see and blame the Biden administration for single-handedly casting America back into a Cold War posture that puts us on the most dangerous, vulnerable position since 1961. And that is the political impact of such a declaration. It doesn't matter the degree or the types of weapons are there. The mere suggestion that Russia will do that because of the Biden provocations is devastating politically. And I would say on a negotiation level, if the Russians were intelligent, they would directly confront the Biden negotiators, Wendy Sherman, Victoria Nuland, and the rest of them. They would be directly confronted with the Russians, and the Russians would say, listen, you are attempting to distract, and you are attempting to engage in a foreign policy fiasco and a color revolution to avert your own disaster with your own people. It's very clear to us in the world that your own citizens are rejecting Joe Biden. They're rejecting the Democrat authoritarianism. Your country is going into civil war. It's very clear that the American people reject your wokeism. They reject every policy that you're advancing, including your hyper-authoritarian state over your vaccine mandates. And it's very clear that you're so desperate to try and get out of that hole that you're trying to dig a new one in Ukraine. But we're not going to take the bait. Europe is not taking the bait. Germany is not going to cut off Russia from the SWIFT financial system because Germany would freeze to death. And Ukraine knows it would lose in any military engagement against Russia. And every European country is also very familiar that Russia does not pose a threat to Europe. So you're witnessing the entire collapse of the American foreign policy, liberal leftist, Biden neocon Zionist establishment. And it's, I think it's a good thing, actually, because with the death of these fanatics and these silly people like Victoria Nuland and Blinken and Jen Psaki and Wendy Sherman and a host of other CIA sub-agents, you're going to at last see Europe return to a semblance of peace with Russia and stability. And I think Ukraine will naturally evolve out of this madness that Zelensky has inputted into it, and you'll probably see a much more moderate new Ukraine regime replace him.
Mr. Bennett, of course, a lot of people, I'm pretty sure there are, who are not familiar with the situation in that region might think that it is out of good intentions that the U.S. is right now backing Ukraine in this matter. How would you comment on this? Is this really the interest in Ukraine's security that has brought America all the way, and those bases around the Russian border, or perhaps it is something larger at play? It's not Ukraine at all, or not to that extent.
No, I think your observation is very wise. This isn't anything beneficial to Ukraine. This is part of a large U.S. hegemonic empire CIA plot plan that the neocons have been ambitiously pursuing since the fall of the Soviet Union. And they've been encircling Russia with 700 bases. They've been trying to decapitate regimes all over that area to make them subject to the Rothschild Zionist Jewish banking system. And this is a pursuit of that agenda, but I think it's finally blowing back and coming to an end. Look at what they've tried to do to Kazakhstan. They tried to do another color revolution. They had a Kazakhstan replacement sitting in France, a banker who had been kicked out of the country and was wanted for charges of bank fraud and murder. They tried to do another Shalabi replacement like they did in Iraq, replacing the Iraqi Saddam Hussein with Shalabi, who was a CIA pick, and that ultimately totally failed and turned Iraq into a very problematic situation. They've recently tried to do that in Kazakhstan. They've also tried to do it in Venezuela with Juan Guaido. That has failed. So I think the U.S. did it successfully through Victoria Nuland, who famously said, F the EU, in a very profane and ugly cursing rant. And the color revolutions and regime changes have always been the notorious leapfrogging strategy of the West. But as they failed in Kazakhstan and they failed in Venezuela and they're failing in Ukraine, you're seeing Europe with Germany more specifically and these other former Eastern European countries rejecting the Western hegemony, rejecting the West's fomenting of conflict. And the Russians are very cool customers. They're very relaxed. They're not going to take the bait. They're not going to engage in a kinetic operation. They're not going to justify the U.S. Or give it a sense of command authority over Europe by engaging in any direct confrontation. They're going to slowly turn up the fire and slowly boil the United States foreign policy team and say, you have no legitimacy in Europe, you're not Europeans, and everything that you've touched is turned to ashes, fire, and destruction. We are not going to let you do that in Donbass. We're not going to let you do it in Lugansk. We're not going to let you do it in Crimea. And I think the European nations have so much to lose, specifically financially and with the natural gas and oil that they need for a cold winter. You've got the U.S. basically checkmated and in a stalemate, and that's why you see them behaving like children in tantrums. So I think Russia is just going to present what they want done, and they're going to walk away and ignore the United States. They're going to ignore Victoria Nuland, but if they're smart, they will directly confront the U.S. negotiators and say, you are doing this out of fear of your own people. It's very clear that your country and Biden and the Democrats have become fascist, authoritarians. You're locking up your own people on Capitol Hill in jails that make Japanese prison camps in World War II look like Hilton hotels. You're engaging in the persecution of mothers and fathers that challenge the left-wing ideology being fed to their children. You're sending the FBI and Homeland Security and the military to pursue your own citizens. What you hate the United States for is the reason that you're coming out trying to invent a conflict with Russia. But we're telling the world, and your own people are hearing our voice, and it's your own people that will throw you overboard, not the Russians. So I think they're going to be pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. Many thanks for those comments and your time, sir. Scott Bennett is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer who joined us via Skype out of San Francisco.
Review program where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. Russian foreign minister has once again dismissed Western claims that Moscow is planning to invade Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov made the remarks after a high-stakes meeting with his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken in Geneva.
I would like to reiterate once again, at the end of our meeting, we agreed that next week the U.S. is going to present us with written answers to all of our proposals. And you also said, in particular, that Ukraine represents no threat to Russia. And I would like to once again remind everyone who analyzes our public statements and our analysis, and I would like to say that never before has Russia threatened through its official representatives the Ukrainian people. He said there would be a response to...
Lavrov said talks with Blinken were open and useful. He added that Russia is concerned about weapons and Western military experts being sent to Ukraine, accusing NATO of working against his country. The U.S.-Russia meeting comes amid rising tensions over Ukraine. U.S. and its allies say that Russia is planning to use over 100,000 troops deployed near the Ukrainian border for an invasion. Russia, in turn, has accused the West of plotting provocations in Ukraine. Russia wants binding security guarantees, including a permanent ban on Ukrainian membership into NATO. The U.S. and military alliance have rejected the demand, warning that any attack on Ukraine will have costly consequences.
We've been clear. If any Russian military forces move across Ukraine's border, that's a renewed invasion. It will be met with swift, severe, and a united response from the United States and our partners and allies. We also know from experience.
Antony Blinken described his discussions with Lavrov as frank and substantive. He said the U.S. and its European allies stand firmly with Ukraine in support of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Blinken also vowed a decisive, calibrated, and united response to any non-military Russian aggression, including cyber attacks and paramilitary tactics. He said the U.S. is prepared to pursue possible means of addressing Russian concerns in the spirit of reciprocity. The Blinken reiterated that he hadn't expected Washington and Moscow to resolve their differences in this meeting, but hopes to keep a diplomatic path to address issues still open. Joining us now for the program is Mr. Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, joining us out of San Francisco, California, and Sarah Flounders from the International Action Center, joining us from New York. Hello, and I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess, Ms. Flounders, we'll start with you. Hope you're safe and doing well out there in New York. Your thoughts on this meeting and subsequent meetings and the fact that why are we still at an impasse at this point with respect to the tensions at hand?
Well, we're at an impasse, and we got to know who's responsible for this crisis. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, Russian President Putin made it absolutely clear, drew the line. He said we have to make it clear any further movement of NATO to the east is unacceptable. And this is what the U.S. is consciously violating with NATO. Putin asked, are we deploying missiles near the U.S. border? No, we are not. It is the United States that has come to our home with its missiles and is already standing on our doorstep. Is it going too far to demand that no strike systems be placed near our home? What's so unusual about this? Now that really sums up who is creating this crisis by encouraging Ukraine's membership into NATO, by moving all sorts of missile batteries and weapons and much more planned into the Ukraine, and even into organizing the fascist coup that overthrew the elected government in Ukraine in 2014, which at the time, Assistant Secretary of State Nuland bragged that the U.S. had spent more than $5 billion to do this, with organizations, with social media, and so on. So here you have a stage-managed crisis to expand NATO right to Russia's doorstep, and Russia is moving troops within its own borders. What's wrong with that? Absolutely nothing.
Thank you, ma'am. And Scott, welcome to the program there. Hope you're doing well out there in San Francisco. Now, it's funny because Antony Blinken, Scott, says that if Russia makes a misstep, it's going to be met with a united and swift and severe response. Emmanuel Macron just a couple days ago was in front of the Europeans saying that, look, we need to start coming up with our own policy completely independent of Washington because they got sidelined when it came to Afghanistan's withdrawal. They've been silent. Well, the French are probably still bitter about that submarine deal with the British and the Australians and whatnot and the U.S. And but then again, and obviously he's also implying at this point in the game that maybe they're not on the same page when it comes to Russia and confronting Russia on the Ukrainian border when it comes to NATO. Your initial thoughts on this?
Well, I agree with everything your other guest said, and it's important to compartmentalize these different strategic diplomatic operations, and Russia, I think, is very good at doing that. So your instinct is proper that France needs to be compartmentalized. Russia needs to look at France as a different theater of operation. Britain is a different theater of operation. The United States is a different theater of operation. I agree with everything your other guest said. I would say on a strategic level, Russia needs to really up its game and be a lot more aggressive in pointing out the obvious and saying the obvious, and pointing out that this is entirely manufactured by the West because of their own social political disintegration. Joe Biden has a 30% approval and favorability rating, and he has been engaging in all sorts of authoritarian actions against his own people, as has Boris Johnson. The European nations and NATO and Canada and America and Australia, they have turned into prison states. And Russia really needs to say, we are the country of freedom and liberty. We are the country that invites all of these oppressed peoples in America, Canada, and Australia. Come to Russia if you want true freedom. You can no longer get it in the West. And that would cause the West to go absolutely apoplectic and fall apart like a wet paper bag, because they pride themselves on the veneer or the illusion, the mirage of democracy and human rights and freedom. All of that is a complete lie. In the past 2 years, we have seen that evaporate. So Russia really needs to point out the hypocrisy of the West. It also needs to prepare for false flag attacks being launched against Moscow by MI6, MI5, FBI, CIA, and Mossad operations, because they always work in tandem. And they're desperate to try and provoke Russia into response, and Russia won't take the bait. They will most likely sit back and play a long game where the West is playing a short game, and the West is doing it like children in a tantrum rather than sophisticated diplomats.
Thank you, Scott. And Ms. Flounders, there's this article out of Sky News a few hours ago. It said a group of around 30 elite British troops have arrived in Ukraine to help train Ukrainian armed forces on new anti-tank weapons gifted by the UK government amid fears of an imminent new Russian invasion. Members of the Ranger Regiment, along with some 2,000 anti-tank missile launchers, were just freely given to Kiev. The Russian embassy to the UK posted on Twitter, "It is crystal clear that the UK shipment of lethal weapons to Ukraine will only fuel the crisis. The UK insists military support poses no threat to Russia." So who does it then pose a threat to? I don't have any tanks, Ms. Flounders. Do you?
Well, it's true that the United States is not acting alone. British imperialism is their junior partner and has been aggressively in the forefront, is actually building 2 Navy bases in the Black Sea. And between Britain and the US, they've done naval war games right on Russia's border in the Black Sea this summer and again later. There have been the number of not only weapons directly to Ukraine, but ships in the Black Sea, and now the building of ports in the Black Sea by NATO countries. Every step of this is aggressive, is threatening, and it is intended to threaten Russia. It's also intended to threaten other European countries into going along with it. It's an effort to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipelines coming into Germany. The US has big interests, and they are willing to sabotage economic developments of their own allies. They have no scruples about this. So it is, yes, a fight against Russia. It's also a fight within NATO. Who will have dominance, and can they more closely tie Germany to fracked oil from the United States and stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
And Scott, why is it out of the question when it's so important, and NATO's already close enough to Russia's borders without Ukraine's inclusion, without going that far east right up to Russia's doorsteps? It's practically in a couple countries very close right up at Russia's doorsteps. They're just saying no more. Why is that out of the question for Washington and its allies at this point in the game to entertain?
Well, Russia and NATO look at this from different vantage points. Russia looks at it from a military defensive vantage point. It does not want weapons that close to its border, whereas NATO looks at the Ukrainian membership as simply an economic extension of its lifeline. NATO is a defunct organization. It has no purpose, and that's why they have to absorb Ukraine to give it fresh breath, fresh life, and an appearance of solidarity and significance when it has none. If I was Russia, I would be engaging in all sorts of conversations, phone calls, emails, diplomatic trips to Mexico, to Canada, to South American countries, Caribbean islands, with every topic from naval bases to training operations, joint training operations. I would be flooding the NSA and the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency's computer networks with chatter and traffic that Russia is on a full-born joint military expansionary agenda with China and Iran, as its recent military practice sessions and training exercises with Iran and China demonstrate. So two can play that game. If the West wants to invent another Cuban Missile Crisis, then Russia is certainly capable of flooding the chatter with hints and suggestions and possibilities that it's going to create its own naval base in the Caribbean, that it's going to engage in a parachute operation with Panama, that it's going to engage in a naval port in the Dominican Republic, that it is going to do paratrooper school in Canada with the Chinese troops up there, that it may even do a beach landing in Hawaii. Those sort of suggestions might get the West's attention to recognize what they're doing to Russia, Russia is very capable of doing against the West, but with China and Iran as its allies, then that becomes a very serious potential for scaring the West into some action. So I think the West has bitten off more than it can chew. The British have led this initiative. The Biden administration, of course, is falling apart like the zombie that it is, and everyone is recognizing the West is weak and confused and schizophrenic. And Lavrov knows this very well. Putin knows this, but they're not going to be goaded into a provocation. They're going to sit back and watch the West collapse under the weight of its own stupidity.
Thank you both. Always a pleasure to check in with both of you. Mr. Scott Bennett there joining us from San Francisco, California, and Sarah Flounders there from the International Action Center joining us out of New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.
You're watching Press TV's News Review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this segment of the program, the United States delivering a long-awaited response to Russia's security proposals. Washington is turning down Moscow's demand to bar Ukraine from joining NATO. This is part of Washington's formal response to Moscow's demands to resolve the Ukraine crisis. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says the U.S. response includes a pragmatic evaluation of the concerns Moscow has raised, as well as Washington's proposals to defuse tensions.
All told, it sets out a serious diplomatic path forward, should Russia choose it. The document we've delivered includes concerns of the United States and our allies and partners about Russia's actions that undermine security, a principled and pragmatic evaluation of the concerns that Russia has raised, and our own proposals for areas where we may be able to find common ground.
During talks with the U.S. in Geneva over Ukraine, Russia had demanded that NATO not admit Ukraine or establish bases in ex-Soviet states. On Wednesday, Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany agreed that a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine should be observed following negotiations in Paris. However, Russia's chief negotiator, Dmitry Kozak, says many issues concerning a peace settlement remain unresolved. Meanwhile, Canada has extended its soldier training mission in Ukraine for 3 years. It will also send another 60 troops to bolster its contingent of 200 soldiers for training Ukrainian soldiers. Tensions have escalated in recent months between Russia and the West. The U.S. and its allies accuse Moscow of planning to invade Ukraine. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman even claims that the attack will take place between now and the middle of February. Moscow denies it has plans to invade its neighbor, but has said that Ukraine's NATO membership is a red flag. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer and political commentator Scott Bennett, who's joining us from San Francisco. We also have journalist and political commentator Fred Weir, who's joining us from the Russian capital, Moscow. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Bennett in San Francisco. U.S. and NATO have so far rejected Russia's security demands. The Russian negotiator at the Paris talks said that many outstanding issues remain. Does outstanding issues mean a continued tension with Russia?
I think what it is meaning is that NATO and the United States State Department, specifically Jake Sullivan and Blinken and Ned Price, are all scrambling and in a form of a political nervous breakdown and a descent into schizophrenia, because they are saying to the Russians, please don't make known our response to anyone. We're hiding it from our own public. And we're asking you to do the same, to hide it from your public, to which the Russians have responded, no, we will make it known to our public. And I think that is a tremendous demonstration of the difference between this current Biden administration State Department and how they look with fear and dread of the American citizenry, that they are so panic-stricken about how potentially badly the American people will respond to what they eventually discover, the State Department's been writing, that they're more nervous about being overthrown by the American citizens than they are with a conflict with Russia. And I think that's laughable, but it's also tragic and very dangerous that Joe Biden, a walking demented zombie, and the rest of his infantile practitioners of diplomacy are rushing around trying to stir up conflict with Russia to distract away from their own domestic revolutionary war or civil war or whatever they're trying to impose upon their own people. And they're making threats against Belarus as well, essentially and ironically warning Belarus that if they allow Russians to ally with Belarus and station troops there, much like the U.S. and NATO are asking Ukraine to do with their troops, then somehow the West has a moral imperative to conquer Belarus as well. So it is such a ironic or schizophrenic or hypocritical demonstration of deceit that one can hardly even believe that this is reality. Of course, the West and America in particular and the British are not dealing in reality. They're dealing in fantasy, in these delusions that they have a global call to be the high priest and the high policeman of the world. But I think it's going to blow back tremendously. I think all of the former Soviet Union republics, Hungary, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, Slovakia, all of these countries are re-examining their ties with the West because of the immorality that the West and European Union and NATO countries demonstrate. And I think Russia is emerging as really the power leader of Europe from this point forward.
Let's bring in Mr. Weir in Moscow. The U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman has claimed that the attack will take place between now and the middle of February, alluding to Russia allegedly wanting to invade Ukraine. What goes through your mind when you hear Washington give such a precise timeline?
You know, you should consult with the Defense Ministry in Kiev, where they've done a very thorough report, which finds, I mean, these are the Ukrainians, the putative target of the Russian invasion, and they find there is nothing resembling a viable invasion force on their borders. I think that this talk of war is mainly coming out of Washington, and I take an optimistic view on this. I think that there is a deal to be made. I do believe that the diplomatic process is going on, and of course, American diplomats, Anthony Blinken, are, making these irreconcilable statements, talking about principle. But I think it's clear that that they don't hold a lot of cards here. There isn't any possibility of Ukraine joining NATO down the road. So that's a bargaining chip that matters a lot to the Russians. They would like to get ironclad guarantees, but it's worthless to the West. And it will only lead to conflict. And I know there are people in Washington who would like to see that conflict, but as I say, I'm optimistic. I hope that saner heads will prevail. And what strikes me as most cogent and important here in this situation is that the diplomatic process is continuing. Washington did give a written response when the Russians said so. They met that deadline. It means they want to continue talking, and that's always better. And it also seems that there can be a deal here, not just Ukraine as a neutral country, but perhaps a belt of neutral countries, including Georgia, Moldova, even Moscow-aligned Belarus, which has a neutrality clause in its constitution, could be included in that belt of neutral countries, which would be between Russia and NATO and would greatly stabilize the order in Europe.
Back to Mr. Bennett. The Qatari Emir is scheduled to visit the United States soon. They're scheduled to discuss Qatar probably replacing Russia as an alternative in providing Europe with gas. It doesn't seem that there's any light at the end of the tunnel when we see the United States taking this type of action, being so proactive in trying to even distance Russia from Europe when we're looking at what's going to take place soon.
Well, comparing Russian diplomats such as Lavrov and Medvedev and President Putin, comparing those men and their histories of geopolitical intelligence operations, comparing them to Biden and Blinken and the rest of these amateurs is truly like comparing a professional soldier to a Boy Scout with a wooden gun. The military of NATO and the European Union as well are like, neutered show dogs. They're not guard dogs. They're not fighters. They're not true military operatives. They are pomp and circumstance parade, participants. Whereas Russia is a serious country with serious weaponry and serious situations. It is concerned about the safety of its people and its borders, and it recognizes very clearly, with typical Russian scientific acumen, that military missiles placed in Ukraine can very quickly be changed into aggressive military nuclear missiles and other very dangerous weapons that could strike Moscow. And they're not going to tolerate that. They're not going to trust the good intentions of the West. Look what happened to Libya when they did. Look what happened to Syria. Look what happened to Iraq. Look what happened to Afghanistan. So the West has a long trajectory and a long trail of dead bodies and ash and rubble and the destruction of countries and nations and governments in its 20 years of history. And Russia knows that. And I think the rest of the Middle East is waking up to that too. Qatar and Saudi Arabia and these other nations are looking at the United States, in particular Biden, and they're losing all confidence in him. And they may promise certain things, and they may accept invitations by the CIA to come to Washington and take photo ops. But I think in the heart of hearts, all of these nations are ready to cash in their chips and abandon all serious alliances and relationships and other treaties with the United States, sure, because we know how much that carries. The JCPOA is a prime example. So Lavrov should simply light a cigarette, blow smoke in Blinken's face, and smile and say checkmate as he pushes a piece of paper across the desk and says, "Sign that, Blinken, sign that, Biden, and we'll forgive you." And I bet they will.
Sure, Mr. Weir, we're short of time. Very briefly, if you may, Canada is extending its presence in Ukraine. It's supposed to add more troops to its contingent there. Unpack that for us very briefly, if you may.
It's not very helpful. Canada, which is my native land, has taken a much harder line here pro-Kiev than even Washington. Even they're like outperforming the Americans in terms of this kind of support for hardliners in Kiev. And I mean, it doesn't matter much. I mean, it really doesn't matter much that they're arming the Ukrainian army and so on. I mean, they armed the Afghan army for 20 years. How did that turn out? I don't think these symbolics matter very much.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen. Scott Bennett joining us from San Francisco, and also thanks to Mr. Fred Weir speaking to us from the Russian capital, Moscow. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.
Tensions simmer between Russia and NATO over Ukraine. Moscow says the West is spreading lies about an impending Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry says Western countries are using media to spread the false information. The ministry says Western countries are trying to distract attention from their own aggressive actions. Earlier on Friday, Washington warned about a possible Russian invasion of Ukraine within days. The U.S. National Security Advisor says Moscow has massed enough troops near the borders to do so.
We continue to see signs of Russian escalation, including new forces arriving at the Ukrainian border. As we've said before, We are in the window when an invasion could begin at any time, should Vladimir Putin decide to order it. I will not comment on the details of our intelligence information, but I do want to be clear. It could begin during the Olympics, despite a lot of speculation that it would only happen after the Olympics immediately. We want to be crystal clear on this point.
Sullivan also urged all U.S. citizens to leave Ukraine within 48 hours. Meanwhile, U.S. officials say 3,000 additional troops will be sent to Poland in the coming days. That's part of NATO's deployment of troops and military hardware in Eastern Europe, allegedly to defend Ukraine. Moscow says the deployments are provocative. It has warned NATO against getting closer to its borders. For more on that from San Francisco, we have Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer. Mr. Bennett, thank you for joining us. Well, the U.S. is urging its citizens to leave Ukraine within 48 hours. It's planning to close its embassy in Kiev. Jake Sullivan has even laid out a plan for what a supposed Russian invasion would look like, saying, and I'm quoting him, it would begin with aerial bombing and missile attacks that could obviously kill civilians without regard to their nationality, and a subsequent ground invasion. If they really do have all this detailed information about an imminent attack, why aren't they sharing the evidence with the rest of the world to see?
Well, because they're lying, very simply stated. They're lying through their teeth, and they know they're lying, and you can see that in their faces as they stutter and stammer and sweat and look down at the ground as they tell their lies. Everyone who's intelligent and who has worked in the military or the intelligence fields in America are all in agreement that this is a complete fraud. We've been talking about this for weeks. And what the U.S. Biden administration is doing is an old psychological warfare trick. They are trying to fill the minds of people with the imagery and the sounds of planes and missiles and buses and trains and fleeing refugees and fleeing people and the panic and the smoke. And they're trying desperately to create imagery of refugees on the streets fleeing Ukraine as if it was France, 1940, and the Germans are invading France. That's what the U.S. is desperately trying to do, because they are committed to a war, a conflict, out of delusion and really out of an agenda to distract the American population and the world, but largely the American population, away from their own civil wars that are brewing in this country. This is extraordinarily important to understand that the West, specifically America and Canada and Australia and New Zealand, are all being overthrown by their people. The governments of tyranny and the police states that have risen are being overthrown by their own truckers, their own blue-collar workers, their own average citizens. They're overthrowing this tyranny of masks and vaccines, and that's causing a tremendous degree of fear of revolution in the West. So how do they escape that? Well, they try and pretend there's going to be a war, and they lie through their teeth. And I think what's interesting, of course, is that the Russians are slowly dismantling this war frantic chicken little approach by inviting countries like France and others to enter into mutual non-aggression pacts and mutual peace and stability agreements that will nullify the war agenda of NATO. And this is a brilliant tactic by erecting independent agreements between Russia and France and other countries like Croatia and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Slovakia and Lithuania and Latvia. What Russia is essentially doing is, we promise not to have any invasion or conflict with your country or your people if you don't have it with us. And the more countries that are added to that non-aggression agreement, the less Europe as a whole will be united to use NATO as an excuse for a military agenda of hostility, like they employed against Libya and Syria and so many other countries, including Afghanistan. NATO has been deformed into an aggressive empire-building puppet of the United States and Britain. And all of the European nations recognize that in a sense, and they're desperate to break out of that slavery. And I think the Ukraine situation is offering them that because Russia, in no uncertain terms, is saying we will never allow Crimea to be invaded or taken over by hostile forces from America or Britain using Ukraine as a convenient cover. So this is creating a tension that the rest of Europe is quickly throwing up their hands and saying, we do not have a dog in this fight, nor do we want to risk our sons and daughters in a battle against Russia over Ukraine, which is a backwater welfare state in the minds of all of the European and American people, essentially.
Right.
And that's just not a bridge Americans or the European people are willing to die on.
But at the same time, embassies of the U.S., UK, Latvia, Estonia, Denmark, Norway, Japan, South Korea, plus the Israeli regime are urging their civilians to immediately leave Ukraine. Russia's defense minister has said in his own words that we do not entirely and not always understand the reasons behind the escalation of those tensions. And still, we see that the tensions are growing. I mean, why all this sudden hype up of the war hysteria?
Well, it's a lot to do with bribery. The CIA and the United States are always notoriously bribing officials of other countries, and at the same time threatening them with compromising video material that their leaders may have been cornered into doing. The Mossad are very good at doing things like that. So I think these other countries are saying the same thing that the U.S. wants them to say, and they're doing it out of a sense of gratuitous obedience. But when the rubber meets the road and the bullets are ready to fly, no country will take up arms against Russia. And in a sense, Russia has no interest in taking up arms against Ukraine. This has all been greatly distorted and invented by the West out of political desperation of the Biden administration, which is about to fall, I think, in the next year because of the damage. So it's a wag the dog scenario. It is a invention of a false war that never existed in the first place. And Russia is playing it masterfully. And I think Russia, its next phase is going to say, all nations that hate war are friends with Russia. All nations that love war and destruction are enemies of Russia and indeed the enemies of humanity. And Russia simply needs to point to the rest of the world and say, is the world better off after the U.S. and its mainstream media invented the 9/11 wars, or is the world worse off? And these 9/11 wars were caused by America, and they want to do the same thing to other nations. Are we going to tolerate that? Or is the world finally going to unite and stop this war agenda that the U.S. has been unceasingly unleashing upon the rest of the world? And I think the world is ready to turn against war and, ironically, against the United States for starting it all.
Scott Bennett, a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer from San Francisco, many, many thanks.
You're watching Press TV's News Review, where we look deeper into some of the top stories of the day. On this segment of the program, Russia's foreign minister says there's still a chance of striking an agreement on security with the West as the two sides remain locked in a dispute over Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov made the remarks in a meeting with President Vladimir Putin. The top Russian diplomat suggested continuing and ramping up diplomatic efforts to resolve the standoff, but not indefinitely. In another sign of a potential easing of tensions, the Russian defense minister told Putin that some of the massive joint military drills with Belarus are wrapping up. Moscow seeks security guarantees against NATO's eastward expansion, including a permanent ban on Ukraine's accession to the military alliance. It also denies Western accusations of planning an invasion on its neighbor. The U.S. says it will temporarily relocate its embassy in Ukraine. And also, Russia has issued a stern warning to any intruding vessels after it accused a U.S. submarine of violating its waters in the Far East. A senior Russian military official says the country is prepared to open fire on foreign ships and submarines that illegally enter its territorial waters. Stanislav Gadzhi Magomedov has noted that any such decision would have to be made at the highest level. On Saturday, Moscow said one of its naval vessels had chased away a U.S. submarine in Russian waters near the Kuril Islands in the Pacific. The military said it used, quote, appropriate means to force the intruding vessel out of its waters after it ignored a request to leave. Russia's defense ministry summoned the U.S. military attaché over the incident. The U.S. has denied carrying out military operations in Russia's territorial waters. Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, Mr. Scott Bennett, joining us from San Francisco. And also we have Emeritus Professor at the University of Wisconsin, Frank M. Spack, joining us from Madison. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Bennett in San Francisco. The Russians have stated that there's still a chance of striking an agreement on security with the West. What would a deal look like in that case?
Well, the Russians understand that the West, particularly Britain, is hell-bent on a war by any means. So they're trying to deflate that. They're trying to win the hearts and minds of the British people and the European people and the Ukrainian people and the American people. So they are positioning Russia as a voice of peace and stability and emotional sanity, while Britain, specifically the City of London and their puppets in the CIA and the American military, ratchet up their rhetoric about an impending invasion on the 16th of February. And the British are putting, of course, commandos and military assets into Ukraine for most likely false flag operations. So they are ratcheting up quickly because of the civil wars that are starting in America, Canada, and Britain. The Russians understand this, so they are trying to formulate a very quick, peaceful negotiation settlement where the rest of the European continent recognize that they do not want a war. Russia doesn't want a war, and no European country wants to war to send its sons and daughters to. And Russia is in a unique position to call out to the peoples of America and Great Britain, your sons and daughters are not being called to war against us. We have no interest other than our protection and the forbidding of the British Empire, City of London, from expanding itself. Make no doubt, the British and their empirical ambitions look upon Ukraine as a wealth of mineral resources, as a source of human trafficking. They want to do to Ukraine ultimately what they did to Libya. They have no interest in the human benefit or the political growth of Ukraine. They are looking to drain it dry, as they did Afghanistan, as they tried to do to Iraq. And this will, of course, lead to the Ukrainian people, I think, ultimately choosing a route of neutrality like Switzerland and siding with Russia. And the best thing Russia can say is, Mr. Boris Johnson, tear down this wall. Mr. Biden, tear down this wall and leave the people of Europe free and stop trying to start a war to regain the old British Empire of the 1800s.
Frank M. Spack, what about you, your thoughts on the issue? Is there any light at the end of the tunnel with regards to the differences that Russia right now has with NATO and the United States on the other side, what they're calling a dispute on a security agreement?
Well, I think the Russians have been pretty clear, but so have the Ukrainians. Yesterday morning, their ambassador to Great Britain, in a moment of candor, said, yeah, there's a deal possible. We could work out something in terms of NATO, at which point an hour later, he wasn't removed from his post, but the president of Ukraine said, not so fast. So clearly, what we have here is a very complicated situation. I would just like to add one more aspect to this. It was widely reported in the European press that one of the things happening in Ukraine, inside the Ukraine, as a result of this phenomenal mobilization by the United States and drum banging and flag waving, has been a huge increase in right-wing fascist-related militias who have said that they are absolutely opposed to any deal that Zelensky may make. In other words, there's a situation now within Ukraine that's extraordinarily unstable because they are prepared, I think, to take armed action against the Ukrainian government. So you now have a situation where it becomes much more difficult to work something out. Now, the Russians have been quite clear They do not want an expansion, any more expansion of NATO. They think that the last batch was probably in violation of their understandings. But nonetheless, they don't want an expansion of NATO into Ukraine. And Ukraine has said the same thing, incidentally, on several occasions. So I think there's definitely a way out. The only thing is, the only people at the table are the Russians and the United States. The Ukrainians have not been at these tables. And in addition to that, and I think Iran is example here, the Europeans have refused to act independently. Even when the United States withdrew from the joint treaty, the Europeans, who had obligations under this treaty, could not pull themselves together enough to act independently of the United States. And that is another a very, very concerning issue here, at least for me, because what I'm afraid of is that the United States could act unilaterally. This evening on the news here in the United States, somebody said, well, you know, the American troops in Europe are not under NATO command. They're under our command. And so, you know, whatever NATO does, that's important, but it is not the same thing as what the United States may decide to do. So I agree that we have taken a posture here of extreme militancy, almost like we'll be disappointed if on Thursday there's not a war. But everybody else is saying, wait a second here, we're not interested in this. So yes, there's a way out if we would stop saying to the Ukrainians what they're going to do.
Scott Bennett, Moscow said one of its naval vessels had chased away a U.S. submarine in Russian waters near the Kuril Islands in the Pacific. Of course, it issued a warning to any intruding vessels there. What do you make of this scenario and I would say, the suspicious timing of all of this?
Well, the Russians have superior technology in many, many areas. Their missile technology, their hypersonic torpedo technology. No doubt they are engaging in depth charge training operations with their naval vessels, which are thundering explosions that the submarines cannot withstand, and therefore quickly depart the region when they are near depth charge operations. So I think Russia is preparing itself to defend its territorial integrity from a joint British-American operation that will be used to trigger some kind of a false flag like they did in Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin, claiming that a U.S. ship had been struck, with the U.S. Or the Lusitania back before World War I. They'll most likely do a shoot down of a possible plane. This is how their hostilities start. That's why the British are ratcheting up and taking a lead in the information war. And the Americans, under the tutelage of the walking zombie retard Joe Biden, really don't know what they're doing, but they're stumbling along, and they're denying the Ukrainian people their own ability to choose their own destiny. And they've been doing that since 2006. But I think the European people of the European continents, which are being approached by Russia to form mutual non-aggression pacts, are going to be slowly discombobulating and divorcing themselves from the NATO imperatives of war, and you will quickly see NATO's hostile agenda running out of gas. And they're doing this again because Canada is going through a revolution, the United States is going through a revolution, so is Australia, so is New Zealand, because of the oppression and the tyranny of the Western societies that have deformed into police states. And Russia recognizes this, it has commented on this, it has said this is all a escape valve, an attempt to distract its own populations away from the conflict and the social uprisings that are happening in the U.S. And the best way to distract the domestic audiences is through a war. So I think Russia recognizes the West, particularly Britain and America, are hell-bent on a war for their own political regime's survivability, and they're playing soft power very wisely. They're not going to aggravate the situation. They're not certainly going to invade. They're not going to engage in any sort of troop movements into the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but they are going to be guarding their territory, and they're in it for the long haul. So don't be surprised if you see Russia constantly moving near and about and over and through its own borders for the next 6 months to a year, but it is taking very careful actions not to be the scapegoat for the British or the Americans to say you are leading the conflict. Russia's not going to fall into that. And I think the more Russia and countries like Russia and Iran jointly say the British Empire and the American Empire, which is the British puppet of the City of London, are traditionally the warmongers of the world and the slavers of the world. And it is time to end that and free all people, starting with Ukraine.
Frank Hemsback, final comment from you very briefly, if you may. Do you think that a false flag operation could be on the agenda of U.S. and friends?
Well, it's possible. I think Ukraine is an unstable country. They've had changes of government that are extra legal. The two opposition candidates are in jail. The government has said they're going to crack down. You've had the Americans deliberately destabilize the economy this week, where they said everybody has to leave. There's thousands of Americans there, people who are doing business, investing. The Ukrainians are getting dollars from the United States to run the country. So all of a sudden we say we're leaving. I mean, you know, all that destabilizes the Ukraine. So I don't think you even need a false flag operation. You just need the usual chaos in Ukrainian politics here to come forward and challenge the government. Because the people who are doing this, the right wing that I referenced before, are armed. They've said they have no interest in whatsoever in working out a deal with anybody, and that if Zelensky does that, they're going to overthrow him. So, you know, you have a situation here that is extraordinarily fraught. And that's without the false flag business, which, well, you know, I agree. I mean, we saw that with the Tonkin Gulf. We certainly saw that with Iraq. We've seen that in very, very many places in the last 20 years. So I think that's a danger also. But the real danger is this. Here in the United States, the leadership of this country has got to decide that they're not interested in going further here. That has to be, you know, number one. And I hope that happens. I'm not sure that it will. I don't see a countervailing force in the Senate and the House.
From Madison, Frank Hemsback, and from San Francisco, Mr. Scott Bennett. Gentlemen, thank you for contributing to this segment of the program. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Press TV's News Review program. Now, the U.S. President ramps up his rhetoric against Russia amid mounting tensions in Eastern Europe. Joe Biden once again claims a Russian invasion of Ukraine is imminent.
But the fact remains, Russian troops currently have Ukraine surrounded from Belarus along the Russian border and with Ukraine to the Black Sea in the south and all of its border. You know, look, we have reason to believe the Russian forces are planning to and intend to attack Ukraine in the coming week, in the coming days. We believe that they will target Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million innocent people.
Biden said that he is convinced his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, has already made up his mind on an invasion of Ukraine. U.S. President warned war will close the window for diplomacy with Moscow. Biden also said that Western countries won't deploy troops in Ukraine, but will continue to bolster its defensive capabilities. Earlier, the White House said that Washington and its allies are working on a sanctions package in case of a Russian invasion. This is while Italy says bans should not target energy imports from Russia. Joining us now for this program is Mr. Jim Kavanaugh, political analyst and blogger from The Polemicist, joining us out of New York, and Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, joining us out of San Francisco, California. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. Now, if we could, I guess we'll start with you, Mr. Jim Kavanaugh. Now, U.S. claims, Jim, that Russia will invade Ukraine and target Kiev soon. Are there any indications or proof for the claim? Because earlier, Washington claimed an invasion will take place on Wednesday, but obviously it did not. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, they gave a very precise date 2 days ago, and it didn't happen. So they're boxing themselves into a corner rhetorically here, and you know, and even the Ukrainian government and the Czech government have said, you know, this is silly, this is not going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. I do think there's a danger, and the danger is this. I think if the Americans keep saying this with such certainty, they're either very foolish if they don't have serious smoking gun information, or there's something else going on. And the danger is this. I think the Americans might know that there's a imminent attack on the Donbas region from Kiev, Ukrainian troops, that they're intending to mount an offensive. If they do, the Russians will react as much as they need to militarily. I don't think they will need to invade Ukraine. They don't want to take over the country of Ukraine, which is a failed state. But they will defend the Donbas region, and they will do it with whatever military means are necessary. They'll probably be able to do it without a ground invasion, but that will happen. And whatever they do will be portrayed as a Russian invasion. So I'm very worried about this at this point, given the American rhetoric. And I think that's where the real danger lies. And the Americans are trying they're saying to the Russians, essentially, we know that the Ukrainian government is going to attack Donbas, and if you support them in any kind of military way, we've already set it up to characterize that as your invasion of Ukraine, and the game will be on then.
And Scott, I'd like to, if you could, welcome to the program there, bud. Hope you're safe and doing well out there in San Francisco. Now, Scott, if you could weigh on that. I mean, we've seen journalists ask Joe Biden for proof of that claim that there's an imminent attack about to take place any second. We've heard Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, actually allude to it, saying that maybe we have different intel than Washington does, because we're not privy to that kind of intel. We haven't been, at least. You would think that Kiev would be the first and foremost ally to be put on notice. But anyway, or to be basically privileged to that information. My question to you, Scott, where's the proof?
Well, there is no proof. There is only the resounding, shrieking, hilarious lies emanating from the chief zombie himself, Joe Biden, who is the embodiment of the American liberal left that has become a population in need of emotional support animals and schizophrenic retards who don't know what it means to be a male or a female and are caught somewhere in between. So all of this hysterical nonsense, which is animating the left in America, is being expressed in a similar foreign policy schizophrenia that is quite comical to watch, because Lavrov and Putin and most of the Russian diplomatic corps, Zarakova and others, are very sound and well balanced and deep in their identity and their thoughts, and they're unmoved. You see that in their very measured responses and language, while the West, under Biden, amidst his stuttering, clamoring, and false teeth clattering nonsense, are making themselves look more and more ridiculous and deceitful. And I would agree with your other guests. They are planning a false flag attack led by the British, led by the U.S., into Donbass and Lugansk with the agenda of trying to trigger a Russian reaction. So the West is going to engage in a aggressive false flag attack, and I don't think Russia will respond in the way the West wants. They will respond with surgical, annihilating counter moves to defend the people of Lugansk and Donbass and Crimea from the genocide that the West wants to impose. And that is the route to splitting NATO and awakening the independent nations of Europe, that their only hope to regain their sovereignty is to cast away the slave bonds and the rags of servitude which the West and the UK have put upon the independent countries of Europe, and return to their true destiny, which is as independent free states. Russia, ironically, is rising up as the liberator of Europe, while the United Kingdom and the United States is seeking to engage them all into this suicidal war against Russia. But I don't think they're going to go that way. And right. I think you're going to witness Russia very quickly rising in top of the diplomatic relations game.
And Jim, I'm glad that Scott mentioned splitting NATO, because it seems like when it comes to a possible response to the Russians, Washington really wants to shut down this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We've heard Rome and Berlin both opposed to that option. We're already seeing cracks within how, I mean, there's a very intimate energy core relationship between Europe, Russia, that the U.S. kind of isn't too fond of, but nevertheless, it's going to really show its ugly face somewhere. How do you think this is going to play out?
first of all, I'm speaking to has nothing with the politics of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. But this issue of the breaking up of NATO is very important. And what the United States, one of the things the United States doing is trying to discipline these other countries and whip them into shape. As your previous guest, other guest said, it is true that the real hope for this lies in these European countries breaking from the hegemony of the United States and standing up for themselves. Macron tried to do this a little bit. And, you know, clearly the Germans and the French and the Italians don't want this, don't need this. They know it's not in their interest. They're going to be the target. They're going to be the ones that suffer the most from this. But when Scholz came over and spoke with Biden, Biden stood next to him and essentially told him, I'm going to decide whether you get the Nord Stream goes forward. That was an insult. I mean, the Europeans on a lot of fronts can do something really progressive to change the world if they break from American hegemony. And people like Macron and the leaders of Italy and Germany are making noises about it. The problem is, I don't think they're going to go through with it. And I think what the United States wants to do and will do will be to, you know, if there is an attack on Donbass and a Russian military response of some kind, that will be the excuse to whip them back into the discipline of NATO and say, you know, you must support us, you must do away with Nord Stream. That will be a crisis moment for Europe and for NATO. And I'm not sanguine about how it will work out. I think these European states will still line up behind the United States.
But nevertheless, Scott, I think if Russia is slapped with Western sanctions, we're going to see some serious fractures within NATO itself.
I'll always remember that the Biden administration and these fools that are in the State Department are being indicted and exposed for their crimes against humanity, their crimes against President Trump, their election meddling, their false Russian narrative. The Durham investigation is putting on soon-to-be prosecutions of these people, and they're desperate for a war to escape the scrutiny and the spotlight that's falling upon them. So Sullivan and Victoria Nuland and all of these ideologues, far-left ideologues, are being exposed, and their only desperate act is to escape into the smoke of war. And Putin and Lavrov need to be comical and laughing and shaking their head in disgust as they simply tell the truth and say to the European nations in very blunt language, the United States is not the country that is raising democracy and freedom. It's now the opposite. And yes, it may seem an ironic, hypocritical shift from what we knew decades ago, but America has now descended into the police state, and you see that in its mandatory COVID-19 vaccines that are shutting down its economy with the truckers protesting. This is happening in Canada, this is happening in Australia, New Zealand, America, Britain. So the Western countries under the United Kingdom and Boris Johnson and Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau are being overthrown by their own people because of their tyranny and their despotism and their far-left policies of wokeism, the crimes against humanity. And the more Russia simply brings that to the attention, the more European states will side with the moral family values of the Russians and escape and depart and pull themselves free from this insanity that seems to be animating the Biden administration. And your other guest is right. It's an insult to Europeans to say that Biden will make the decision of the Nord Stream pipeline. Biden couldn't make a decision on you know, what his name is. He's so gone in dementia, and all of the people underneath him are soon to be gone into the shackles of prison because of their crimes illustrated under the Hillary Clinton, Russiagate, all of the stuff that they unfolded during the Trump presidency is coming back to haunt them. So Russia needs to treat the U.S. as a country that is in a course of revolution that hopefully will yield a more conservative government that will be more friendly towards Russia and Iran and recognize that they are nations that should be respected. And hopefully the Russians will be able to convince the rest of the European states, don't you want freedom? Don't you want the destiny of your own sovereign identity in place of the slavery and the limited hope that NATO and the European Union has tried to impose on you? I think most of the European nations are ready for a change, And if Russia presents itself as the liberator of Europe and the United States and the United Kingdom as the prison guard of Europe, you'll see NATO break up, you'll see the European Union break up, and that will lead to a safer continent.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us on the program. Scott Bennett from San Francisco and Mr. Jim Kavanaugh, they're joining us out of New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.
Okay, Scott Bennett joins us. He's a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer. Scott, you heard there what the Ukrainian envoy representative to the United Nations said, clearly stating that this is a war against his country. The Russians beg to differ. They say this is a limited operation in the eastern Donbass region, where people of Russian origin reside and have been fleeing to the border to Russia in their masses amid shelling and heavy shelling. What's your take? Is this a war or a special limited operation, as the Russians are saying?
Well, I think this is the Russians protecting the lives of the people who've been crying out for deliverance for the past 6 or 7 years, similar to the ancient Jews crying out to God to rescue them from Pharaoh in Egypt and be delivered from their slavery, their bondage. So the people of Lugansk and Donetsk have been crying out for deliverance from the artillery shells, from the shootings, from the roadside bombs, from the brutality that the Nazi far-right Ukrainian thugs that are paid for by the U.S. and the United Kingdom to be a puppet regime against Russia. These poor people have been crying out for deliverance, and Russia has heard their cry, and the people of the Duma have heard their cry, and Vladimir Putin has honored the words of the Russian people in the Duma and sent troops in to protect these people, not to destroy Ukraine, not to destroy the people of Ukraine, not even to overthrow the Ukrainian government, but to protect lives that have been targeted and murdered by the United States and by the United Kingdom using their puppets in the Ukrainian government and the regime of Zelensky, and before that Poroshenko. So this is nothing more than the Russians slowly and with great measured response establishing that they will not suffer blood being spilled anymore. And they said this in 2014 during the Minsk agreements. And let's never forget that Ukraine overthrew Yanukovych and put in the puppet regime that the United States wanted, that Victoria Nuland wanted, that Alexander Chalupa and all of these Western officials wanted. And these Western officials are notorious for saying, F the EU, we'll do what we want. And they established Ukraine as a corrupt regime with which the U.S. was going to base operations against Russia. They also used Ukraine and the ambassador for Ukraine to invent a false Russian collusion hoax about Donald Trump winning the election from 2016 to 2017. Ukraine was used in that. Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were gangsters stealing money from Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. So Ukraine really has not been anything other than a house of ill repute used egregiously by the United Kingdom and the United States. And the United Kingdom, of course, is also notorious for its exploitation of Ukraine.
Scott, what the Ukrainian envoy representative to the United Nations says that he's calling on the UN to rally around Ukraine and to support Ukraine. What can the UN Security Council do, considering the fact that you've got, for example, China, which has just said its position stays unchanged and it opposes any sanctions on Russia, and China and Russia are both veto members of the UN Security Council?
Well, that's a good point. The United Nations Security Council can do nothing with the veto powers of China and Russia, and no doubt other countries would also veto any aggressive action by the United Nations Security Council, because they've learned the lesson that the United Nations Security Council is often used as a puppet for covering the empirical wars that the U.S. started against Iraq, against Afghanistan. So they really can't do anything. There's something to be said about having peacekeepers hold the peace to stop the shelling and the missiles against the people of Lugansk and Donetsk, and perhaps Russia's peacekeepers and the United Nations peacekeepers could do a joint patrol and make sure that Ukrainian right-wing fascist Nazis are not engaging in guerrilla warfare tactics against civilian populations. This is a war crime, and Ukraine and its puppet regime realizes that it's a war crime. They're paid for by the CIA and the MI6, so they're going to do whatever their masters tell them. But hopefully the rest of Europe is going to look at this and say, this is not a war that we are willing to die upon or send our children to fight and die. This is an area that is holy to Russia and its people and its cultural identity. They've already suffered the lies of German chancellors from World War II that led to the decimation of Russia, that caused it to have to fight back in World War II and destroy the Nazi regime in 1945. They're giving a very clear warning that they're not going to relive the days of 1940 and 1945. They're not going to suffer the extermination that the Nazi right-wing Catholic fascist German hordes were unleashing upon Russia. They're going to allow the people of Donetsk and Lugansk to suffer that fate, and they have been suffering that genocide since 2014. Very similar to how the Yemen people have been suffering a genocide from the Saudi Arabians, again armed by the United States and the United Kingdom. So I think the world is going to recognize the West has been pushing wars, pushing conflict. It has used Ukraine as a prostitute for its own political perversions and economic war and diplomatic war against Russia. And I think Russia is going to respond by protecting the lives. It's very adept at using its military and its intelligence and its cyber operations. Joe Biden is not going to commit troops because he doesn't have the authority. The American people and the American Congress are not going to declare war on Russia and risk the United States of America being crippled by multiple nuclear strikes, crippled by cyber attacks, and a revolution overthrow the entire United States government and kill every legislature that voted for war. That could very well happen. So the American people are not behind this. Therefore, the American Congress are not going to declare war. They may engage in silly sanctions here and there, but what's new? They've been doing this for the last 10 years. And it's a sign of futility and stupidity to keep waging war against Russia that is doing nothing but wanting to preserve its culture and protect itself from missiles being inserted into Ukraine that you would think the U.S. would have learned from during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when it did exactly the same thing by putting missiles into Turkey that caused the Russians to put missiles into Cuba. Now the U.S. and the United Kingdom are trying to use NATO as a cover to insert missiles into Ukraine so that it's minutes away from Russia, the same thing that they're trying to do to Poland. And this is a complete betrayal of all the agreements and the promises and the hopes that were made in the 1990s. They've completely shown that no agreement, no piece of paper, no word from the United States government can be honored and can be seen as anything but a lie, and perhaps a lie in slow motion, but inevitably a lie.
Right.
So I think the people of Europe and these individual countries are going to have to realize this.
Scott, are you saying the days of the West, or are you alluding to the point that the days of the West invading and sending their troops and occupying other countries are over? Because we hear from Western officials and Western mainstream media, and Ukraine, of course, that the international community will hold Russia accountable. But is the international community limited to the West, or is it not? Does it not involve the the Asia or the Arab world, the African world, the Persian Gulf, etc.?
Well, that's a very good point. Those other countries, those other regions, the Asian world, the Middle East, certain parts of Africa, they've all suffered under this United Kingdom colonial empire that has used the American military juggernaut as their enforcer. And the rest of the world has suffered since 2001 lethal blows to their civilizations. And thankfully, this military juggernaut has essentially run out of steam with the defeat of Afghanistan. It was destined to fail from the very beginning. Everybody knew that, and this military empire conquest has dissolved into a whimpering death. But now the world has a duty to stand up and ensure that it never happens again. And the only way that it can do that is through a unipolar world where multiple poles of power exist, from Iran to Russia to the smaller countries in Eastern Europe to countries and regions in Africa and elsewhere. They all need to stand up for sovereignty. In a sense, a new United Nations needs to be created out of the ashes of what has been turned into nothing but more than a Western puppet. But the rest of the world and the friends have seen firsthand that there's no honor or health or constructive growth that has ever been yielded from the Western intervention. Instead, death, chaos, ashes, and slavery and economic destruction have occurred. Look at Syria, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Yemen, look at Libya. All of these are the footprints and blood that the West has left, and now they've been trying to do it in Ukraine to use against Russia. Their agenda has always been to dismember Russia and turn it into a broken group of republics. But I think Russia is standing up and showing the grit that it has as a unique people and culture that, again, they've suffered under German Nazis are once again at the helm of the United Nations and NATO, and they're trying to justify this new anti-Slavic crusade, but the Russians are having no part of it, and they're starting by carving out portions of Ukraine that are Russian ethnic, from Crimea to Donetsk to Lugansk, and I think that's an interesting potential geopolitical checkerboard game that the Russians can continue to play with other countries and essentially nullify NATO by saying, we want to enter into non-aggression commitments and agreements with every independent sovereign nation in Europe. And we will write in blood that Russia promises never to invade Luxembourg if they'll never invade Russia.
Right. So
we'll
Scott,
never invade.
Essentially, what you say, it's the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes, that are trying once again to take the lead here, what, as some observers have noted, against a peacekeeping mission.
Yes, a peacekeeping mission is meant to keep blood from being spilled, old people from being shattered with bombs, little children being torn apart by grenades and bullets that are fired at them from sadistic eyes and brutal Nazi agendas. That's what's been behind a lot of the brutality against the people in Donetsk and Lugansk. And this has come from the United States and the United Kingdom. Their agenda has been constantly defy the Minsk agreements, pay no attention, and kick the Russians out of Crimea and northern Ukraine so that we can continue our war, our Cold War against them. And Putin has announced they're not going to take this anymore, and they're effectively setting up a Great Wall, and they're incorporating Lugansk and Donetsk into it because those are Russian ethnic people. They speak Russian. And I'll tell you, you look at the fireworks in the sky, you look at the tearful eyes of people celebrating in prayer and bowing down to their knees and putting their heads to the ground saying thank you for saving our lives. No more do we live in basements. No more are we living in fear from this Ukrainian Nazi regime that the United States and the United Kingdom have been unleashed. Now they've been given salvation. They've been given hope by the Russian Duma and President Putin. And I think all of Europe needs to reflect that this agenda of war is a product of the United Kingdom and the United States. It's not a product of Russia. Tucker Carlson, the most commentator on American news, has spoken for all conservatives, including myself, when he says, why would we have any aggression or hatred towards Iran or any of these nations that in the past 20 years have never invaded anyone, never caused bloodshed, never dropped a bomb? It's been the United States and the United Kingdom that has decimated much of the world.
Right. Scott,
so I think the world needs to wake up and kick them out.
Scott, thank you for your time. Scott Bennett there, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, joining us live from San Francisco. And our top story, the Russian military says it has successfully reached the goals set out for the first day of Moscow's operations against Ukraine. The military says it has eliminated Ukraine's air defenses and now controls the skies over the country. It says the air raids are not targeting cities and pose no threat to civilians. Russian paratroopers are said to have captured an airfield near the capital, Kiev. Moscow says it is willing to negotiate the terms of surrender with Kiev. A Kremlin spokesman says President Vladimir Putin has expressed his readiness to engage with his Ukrainian counterpart in discussions with a focus on obtaining a guarantee of neutral status and the promise of no weapons on his territory. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, however, says its forces have dealt heavy blows to their adversaries.
The Ukrainian armed forces are indeed involved in heavy fighting, repelling attacks in Donbass and other regions, east, north, south. The enemy sustained serious losses, and the enemy will sustain many more losses. They came on our land. We are already handing out weapons, and will hand them out to defend our country to everyone who wants and has the capacity to defend our sovereignty. The future of Ukraine depends on every citizen.
Ukraine has called on its allies to sever diplomatic ties with Russia and impose sanctions on the country. Kiev has also declared martial law after reporting over 200 attacks from the Russian side. Officials say scores of people have been killed in the first day of fighting. Ukraine says it has killed 50 Russian troops and shot down 6 Russian aircraft, a claim that has not been verified. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi has slammed NATO's eastward expansion, describing the approach as provocative. Raisi says NATO's expansion is a serious threat to stability and security of independent countries in different regions. The Iranian president expressed hope that what is happening at the moment would end in the favor of nations in the region. He made the comments in a telephone conversation with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. For his part, Putin said the current situation is a legitimate response to decades of breaches of security treaties by the West and its efforts to undermine his country's security. And Western countries are taking punitive measures against Russia by imposing a raft of sanctions over its military actions in Ukraine. The United States targeted 5 major Russian banks and several individuals over the Ukraine crisis. Washington also announced new export curbs and warned that more actions against Moscow could follow. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also took sanctions against Russia, targeting some 60 individuals and entities. French President Emmanuel Macron said sanctions against Moscow would be proportionate to what he called the level of its aggression. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson unveiled a massive package of economic sanctions against Moscow over its anti-Kiev move.
Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Not in the infamous phrase.
Johnson accused Moscow of attacking Ukraine without any provocation or credible justification. He said the UK will work with Ukraine and other allies to counter Russia. The president of the European Commission has made similar remarks, saying the bloc will impose massive sanctions on Russia. Scott Bennett is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer and joins us out now live from San Francisco. Scott, welcome. You know, one Western world leader who has been very vocal today on anti-Russian sanctions is the UK PM Boris Johnson, accusing Moscow of attacking Ukraine without any credible. credible justification. Are those remarks justified?
Well, they're the screams of a man dying in a political drowning episode. Boris Johnson is drowning because his own people are turning against him and overthrowing the United Kingdom's government for all of the tyranny that he's unleashed upon them. And this is a convenient distraction operation. So Boris Johnson is a desperate man and thinks that a war or threats of a war or fantasies and imaginations of a war are going to save his political career. And it's not. And that's one of the things that the Russians should be articulating to the world and to the populations of Britain, that Boris Johnson and the United Kingdom have been oppressing and terrorizing their own people and turning it into a police state, as has Canada under Trudeau and Biden in America. That is the key to turn these warmongers, by turning their own people against them and by telling them what they've done. Now, the United Kingdom has been very instrumental in the wars against Russia, starting in 2014, by participating in the MI6 CIA overthrow of the Yanukovych government. They've been sending in their own troops to prepare for guerrilla attacks that have been constantly unleashed upon Lugansk and Donetsk. All of the dead children and the dead seniors that have been living under siege conditions, under constant barrage of artillery rounds and bombings and roadside bombs and sniper attacks. That is the true genocide and the human catastrophe that's been unleashed. And Boris Johnson is responsible for that. Joe Biden is responsible for that. And Ukraine played a pivotal role, never forget, because Victoria Nuland and Alexander Chalupa and the media like Michael Isikoff and all of these Western puppets of the CIA have been using Ukraine for money laundering, human trafficking, and setting up bases of operations using FBI and CIA and signals intelligence to launch operations against Russia with the ultimate goal of trying to plant missile systems that can be used in aggressive actions against Moscow. That's precisely what Vladimir Putin and the Russian Duma are standing up against. And they're really protecting innocent civilians from being slaughtered. So the action of securing Donetsk and Lugansk is a humanitarian action. It will save lives, and I think Russia will win the rest of the world to their side by showing very clearly he has no imperial ambitions. He has only the ambitions of humanity, and if the West was loyal to the democratic fundamentals that they so gloriously celebrate, they would be on the side of Putin and say, yes, we should have honored the Minsk agreements in 2014, but because the West hasn't, because it has been acting in bad faith and never honored a single agreement under its history, they have turned a blind eye to the human suffering in Donetsk and Lugansk, and now Russia is having to step in before a slaughter would take place. So I think this is going to be the end of the puppet regime in Ukraine, and hopefully a more neutral-oriented political leadership will be rising up.
As you know, Scott, it's not just Johnson, Biden, Trudeau, all facing major domestic problems and perhaps using this as a diversion tactic. But, Russia is saying job done for the day. How long do you anticipate Moscow's military activities to carry on for?
It'll be carried out in the next 24 to 48 hours, and then they will simply have perimeter defensive operations, which will stop and annihilate any intrusions or countermeasures. Their main objective is to protect the people and the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk, because they are now independent sovereign republics. They've been independent for 500 years. This is simply a formality of recognizing their official status. And the Russian Duma has recognized them. So they've entered into an agreement with Russia for mutual collaboration and defense, and Russia is going to honor that. Russia is probably not going to press for a regime change of Kiev, but it may, because if Kiev and the Zelensky comedian puppet thinks that it can push the Russians and Putin into a corner, they'll probably have another thing coming. But this is now an information war. And the arsenal of weapons that need to be deployed are simply messages of the truth that the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson has unleashed a tyrannical regime of mandates and vaccines upon his own people. And this is simply a distraction to preserve his political life, which is very quickly ending. And the same thing with Joe Biden. Now they may resort to more false flags. They could try and assassinate Biden or Johnson and blame it on Russia. Nothing is too low for the Democrat leftists. But, the main thing is to convince all of the European powers that the dawn of a new European continent, the dawn of a renaissance of democracy and humanity and sovereignty is upon us. And it starts by following the model of Donetsk and Lugansk. If you can carve out republics of free people to declare that they will not be slaves or will not be puppets or not be held hostage by the United Kingdom or the United States, then every nation in Europe has a chance to declare the same autonomy. And Russia can say, we're willing to enter into a non-aggression pact with every nation in Europe, and we won't invade you and you won't invade us. That goes around NATO, it goes around the European Union, and quite frankly, Iran could follow that same decision-making process, enter into non-aggression pacts with all European nations, and then suddenly the narrative of war, the narrative of Putin and Russia and Iran being tyrannical enemies of democracy suddenly vanishes, because democracy is about allowing people to live their lives and be free and to determine their own destiny. And up until this point, the United States and the United Kingdom has crushed democracy, crushed human rights, crushed freedom, and tried to transform the entire Western society, United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. They have all been subjected to an attempted dictatorial overthrow and coup d'etat by the far left, pushing a religion of lesbian, gay, transgender rights, wokeism, and other crimes against humanity. It is a sick, diabolical, devilish agenda that feeds on war and feeds on suffering, and that is precisely what the people of Donetsk and Lugansk were fighting against. They were tired of the suffering and the injury. They were tired of their children being shredded by shrapnel. They were tired of their old people pleading and crying out to God for deliverance. But I think God was listening, and he answered their prayers, and he sent Vladimir Putin and the Russians to deliver them, like the Jews of old in ancient Egypt were heard. So I think it's an exciting time, and Russia will prevail.
Scott, thank you very much indeed for your time. Scott Bennett is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer joining us live out of San Francisco.
In order to discuss this further, I'm now joined by Scott Bennett, who's a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer joining us from San Francisco. Scott, thank you so much for being with us. There are a number of things that I want to discuss with you. First, what do you make of this new round of sanctions, especially those that target Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov? Do you think these sanctions are biting, especially given the fact that the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman has said neither Lavrov nor Putin has any accounts in Britain or abroad?
Well, it's very clear that Russia has got its blood up, and in this fight, it's had victory. It's been riled and roused and excited, and anyone who's been in the military understands with that adrenaline comes a lot of confidence and a lot of forward momentum. So Russia is going to carry through this momentum and very quickly eliminate all of the political party in Ukraine that has been engaging in genocide against ethnic Russians. Zelensky will be arrested, as will the Azimov battalions. They'll be arrested, prosecuted for war crimes. Putin has said to the Ukrainian military, do not follow these drug addicts, take over. And the Ukrainian army will, I think, take over and declare martial law, and immediate ceasing of hostilities will follow between Russia and Ukraine when the Ukrainian military step in and take over. They'll also simultaneously declare the Lugansk and Donetsk republics independent and a ceasing of hostilities. So I think this is going to be extinguished very quickly, but Ukraine is going to be changed overnight. And you will have a new similar situation to when MacArthur ruled Japan for a period of a year or so. You'll have a military transition to control Ukraine and then fair elections, but you'll also have the expulsion of all the U.S., United Kingdom, NATO spies and diplomats and corruption. So there's a Russian purging of Ukraine that's going to follow. The economic sanctions that NATO, that the United States, that the United Kingdom and Europe has done is really going to destroy Europe and destroy America and Britain. It's not going to harm Russia. Russia doesn't need Europe. Europe needs Russia. Russia doesn't need the United States or Britain.
Scott, let me jump in here for a second. Can you explain to our viewers how Europe and the U.S. are going to pay the price of these sanctions?
They're going to pay the price because natural gas is going to go up to $2,000 for a 1,000 square yards, where right now it's $750. And gas is going to go up, I mean, an incredible percentage. And then you're going to have more expensive food, more expensive heating. Everything is going to be more expensive because of the trucking costs and the shipping costs of everything. And Russia is not going to be harmed at all. All of its gas and resources will be sold to India, to Iran, to China, to other buyers. You'll have also, I think, a lot of the nations in Europe and NATO declare independence and separate from any alliances or any obedience that the United States or the United Kingdom tries to impose upon the smaller countries of Europe. I think you'll witness Europe totally fracture and break up, with countries wanting to keep themselves alive and warm rather than cold and dying, but in obedience to Boris Johnson and Biden. So Russia is going to shift its resources away from Europe. Europe is going to pay far more costs. That's going to break up Europe. It's also going to end the political careers of Boris Johnson, of Joe Biden, of Justin Trudeau, and Germany and Macron. All of them are going to be overthrown by their people, because in the next 6 months to a year, the living standards are going to be very depreciated. You're going to probably even have some major revolutions in Europe because of the suffering that these fools in political office, these arrogant, delusional people thinking that they can go in and create a country and a puppet regime out of Ukraine, fill it with weapons, abuse the Russian ethnic people, and think that Russia is going to stand by and let it happen. Now they're seeing Russia is not standing by. They're rising up. They're going to completely eradicate the fascists and the European puppets from Ukraine. I think you'll also see Russia aggressively engaged in diplomatic war, economic war, and information war against the West, and engage in a lot more treaties and military plans with other countries around America. It's interesting that what Vladimir Putin is doing today is exactly what John F. Kennedy would have done in 1964 when the missile crisis occurred. Kennedy would have went into Cuba if those missiles weren't removed and destroyed Cuba. Putin is doing exactly the same thing. So John F. Kennedy and Vladimir Putin are doing the same thing as each other, and that is removing a threat before it can turn into something that causes World War III.
A very nice comparison indeed.
No idea what's happening.
Let me ask you one more question here. Let's just bring Zelensky into the picture here. He has repeatedly said that the West has left him alone, and he is disappointed to the point that he has unfollowed all world leaders on Twitter. What does that say?
Well, Zelensky knows he's going to be arrested soon. He may even be executed. He may even be assassinated. He may even take his own life in suicide. Zelensky is Hitler in the bunker, but he's not got any cover. He's going to be caught. And remember the war crimes that Zelensky unfurled upon the Russians. People aren't forgetting that. Maria Zakharova said today that the Western journalists are not people. They have no conscience, and they've been lying about this entire thing. Let's remember Zelensky tried to shut down the water plants of Crimea, and now Russia has entered to save these people from starvation and thirst by reopening the water spigots towards Crimea. So Zelensky has engaged in murder of Russian citizens in the Donetsk and Lugansk. He's brutally tried to outlaw the Russian language. He's shut down water. He's been a puppet for the West to try and turn Ukraine into a den of money laundering and criminality. I think the Ukrainian people themselves are going to realize they made a tragic mistake by allowing the United States and the United Kingdom to overthrow the Yanukovych government in 2014, and they are now going to reapproach Russia, and I think Russia will be very gracious, very loving, very generous, and forgiving to Ukraine and the people, and they will completely cleanse that country of the political poison that Britain and the West have planted there. And you really will have Ukraine in the more prosperous position it's ever been in by declaring itself neutral, a new Switzerland, where it does not have any aggression against Russia, nor does it have any aggression or pacts with Europe.
We're running out of time. Sorry to interrupt you there. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on Press TV. I appreciate it. I've been talking to Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer who joined us from San Francisco.
Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, joins us now live from San Francisco. Scott, always good to see you. So the European Union has pulled the plug on Russian media outlets claiming that it's Russian propaganda. If it's propaganda, switch it off. But how important is it to get different narratives on this conflict and not stick to one narrative, which is the Western narrative, because that sounds like propaganda?
Well, the Western narrative is full of lies and deception, and that has been the disease that has into the mainstream media of Western society. Lies and deception ever since 9/11, the endless military juggernaut up against Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. So you're very wise to point out the propaganda and the narrative that the West is trying to put out about this situation in Ukraine is only going to fall apart. That's why people are walking away from it. That's why politicians in Europe are walking away from this. Senior Navy officials in Germany have walked away from this. Many in the United States and the United Kingdom are already condemning the West posture on this because the West has created this situation in the first place. Russia, RT, Sputnik, and these other channels really are unique in their presentation of the truth, the historical truth. And I think Vladimir Putin's speech summarizing all of the historical, political, economic, and military engagements and operations for the past 100 years was an excellently stated, succinct analysis of history and a culmination to where we are now and really moving forward on the trajectory of stabilizing and pacifying this irritation, this infection of violence that the West has been chronically addicted to trying to spread around the world. And I think Press TV also is another example of divine truth that Westerners, if they are exposed more to it, will really come out to a much healthier and more balanced view on these situations in these countries and the revelations of their own government. So we are in a propaganda war. So you're going to see propaganda in the diplomatic circle, in the information circle, in the military circle, and the economic circle. So there are those four battle spaces.
Scott, you know, the now banned Russian media was among, now banned in the EU, was among the few media outlets that was providing details to its audience about Russian peace initiatives by the Kremlin towards Ukraine, and how Moscow is proposing these peace initiatives. So the ones that claim to be seeking peace here, instead of coming up with peace initiatives, instead they are pumping more, as we've just heard from the EU Foreign Policy Chief, who's just announced more lethal weapons to a war zone. How does that bring about peace?
Well, always remember that President Biden and Boris Johnson and Justin Trudeau are desperately trying to cling to power because their own people are overthrowing them. There are revolutionary wars brewing in Canada, in the United States, and in Britain. There are convoys of thousands of Westerners going to their own capital to challenge these sort of operations in Ukraine and the hyper tyrannical actions of mask mandates and vaccines. So this is one of the reasons that they are trying to amplify a war in Ukraine when really there isn't going to be much of a war at all. This is a special military cleanup operation. It will be most likely wrapped up in the next week. And you will see, as I've said before, Vladimir Putin and the Russian Duma and the Russian people declare Ukraine is indeed a free nation and a free people with the freedom of pursuing its own sovereignty and destiny. However, it cannot put in jeopardy the Russian people or the Russian culture or the Russian jeopardy. And what Vladimir Putin is doing today is exactly the same thing that John F. Kennedy would have done in 1964 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Kennedy is doing exactly what Vladimir Putin is doing, and if the American people applauded Kennedy, then they should applaud Vladimir Putin for essentially seeking to stabilize the world with peace and put out this disease of violence that the British and the United States are so desperate to keep going. But I think the world is waking up. The world is going to side with Russia. Europe is going to side with Russia. You'll break up the political regimes, and you will see a much more open and stable Russia and Ukraine and Europe after this episode. It's just going to probably take another 2 weeks to solidify all of that.
Scott, thank you very much indeed for your time. Scott Bennett there, former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, joining us live out.
Well, the fact of the matter is the Israeli Zionist government regime, and particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, are angling to translate or actually relocate a lot of the Israeli population back into the Khazarian historical areas of Ukraine and some of the neighboring geographies. So it's very clear Israel is preparing for an eventual migration of many of its people into that area. The Khazarian history is very clear. So this gives us an insight into why the Israelis are so violently and passionately on the side of the blood-spilling U.S., United Kingdom, NATO war machine. And Israel is actively working against Russia. It's working against Iran. And it's doing so out of its own self-interest, not out of human rights respect, not out of any sort of agenda of liberty or freedom or any of that, but its own cold calculations of population migration. That being said, that gives you an understanding of the psychological operations perspective of Israel. And you also understand that the military-industrial complex of the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO sees a tremendous opportunity for exploitation and financial enslavement of Ukraine, of its resources, through leveraging this war to bury them even further in debt. So the terrible irony of this is that if the Ukrainian people side with the United Kingdom and the United States, they will be destining themselves for a future of misery, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, slave enslavement, and an utter misery under a despotic illusion of democracy. Whereas if the Ukrainian people are wise, they will overthrow the puppets of the Western regime and install a new neutral government that'll seek an equal friendship and relationship with both Russia and Europe. So this missile salvo video, of course, is part of the propaganda war. So the propaganda war is to attempt to show the Ukrainian people as martyrs, as fighting for freedom, fighting for their lives, putting up a brave front, and using weapons that the West has supplied in order to encourage new weapons. Of course, it has been exposed as completely false. This video is emanating from Israel's prior warmongering against Syria, against Lebanon, against Iran. And I think what we're going to see, of course, is a very quick silencing of the internet and the airspace over Ukraine over the next week as Russia wraps up its operations, as the Ukrainian military take over, and most likely Zelensky and his junta regime will be expelled from the country, if not tried for war crimes, as they should be.
And Mr. Bennett, another question. In your opinion, how further can this policy of making fake news can continue?
Well, the sad reality is fake news in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, and Australia, in these citadels of civilization, in these high Babylonian towers of democracy. The truth is, these countries and these governments and these institutions in the West have become rotted with corruption and are decaying in the disease of greed and the despotic thrill of power. That is what was unleashed when the Pandora's box of 9/11 unleashed the U.S. United Kingdom military juggernaut across the world, starting in Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya, then Syria, then Lebanon, and of course with ambitions against Iran, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. So the lies of the deep state have been filling the minds and the temples of the West for 20 years, and it's now reached such a level of intoxication, of slow mental death, of confusion and fear, that the paranoia that permeates Western society and the Western mind is being expressed in this militarism, this hyper military engagement preparation, the illusion and the attempt to make and define this situation in Ukraine and Russia seem like World War III when it's not, and other things that are geared towards a very vain and inevitably failing attempt to dislodge and disrupt Russia from its native historical lands and areas. And I think what you're going to witness through the fake news and this fake war is a turning away of their government from the people. So the American people are rising up against the fraudulent government of Joe Biden. The Canadian government is finding itself alienated from the Canadian people, who are rising up to challenge the forced vaccine mandates, which are a violation of the Nuremberg Code. You see this also in New Zealand and Australia. So the media in Australia and New Zealand and America and Canada and the United Kingdom has demonstrated an absolute contempt for the truth and a contempt for their native populations and citizenry. So for that reason, you most likely will see an overthrow of the Western governments in some way, shape, or form in the next 3 to 6 months, and inevitably and absolutely a year from now. So Boris Johnson will not be the prime minister 6 months from now, I would say. Joe Biden may not be. He could be taken out, assassinated, replaced, or retired under the 18th Amendment for insanity. And the same could happen to New Zealand and Australia. No one seems to really understand the level of absolute intolerance that the Western society and populations have towards their own government. And this attempt to start a war to distract away from the tyranny of the Western governments on their own people is a very thin and shallow and fading operation. No one trusts the Western media. No one trusts their agenda, because the last 2 years have been full of lies. So I would end it by saying what Vladimir Putin has done by going into Ukraine is ironically the very same thing that President John F. Kennedy would have done had the Cuban Missile Crisis been unresolved. John F. Kennedy made it very clear in 1964, I believe it was, when he warned the world and the Soviet Union at the time that they would go into Cuba and remove all the missiles by force. And those missiles were removed, as well as the U.S. missiles from Turkey. But it's very important to review and return to that episode of time, because as time melts, we see the reality of human behavior and human self-survival instinct is exactly the same. And as it was for John F. Kennedy, it is exactly the same for President Vladimir Putin and the Russian people. They are extinguishing a threat before it grows to a lethally toxic level. And Putin is doing the very same noble thing that Americans celebrated under John F. Kennedy. So why they don't celebrate under Putin either shows an ignorance of the truth or an absolute hypocrisy of spirit.